What if the fall of Atlantis wasn't a natural disaster, but a betrayal that doomed an entire civilization? Ancient texts speak of a hidden truth, one that Thoth, the keeper of ancient knowledge, desperately tried to protect. A secret so powerful it could have saved Atlantis, but instead it led to its destruction. The Atlanteans thought they were invincible. They had mastered knowledge, power, and technology beyond belief. Their towers glowed with crystalline light, their machines hummed with energies that resonated with the earth, and their chants aligned with the stars themselves. But greed, power, and betrayal changed everything. Thoth's account describes a civilization filled with wisdom, but blinded by ambition. A betrayal from within, a fatal mistake that no one saw coming. The rulers who had sworn to protect balance abandoned it. Priests who had vowed to guard wisdom followed pride instead. And citizens who once cherished harmony cheered the spectacle of dangerous experiments. Atlantis betrayed itself, piece by piece, until the forces of nature rose in rebellion. Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth that Thoth tried to keep hidden, the betrayal that ultimately caused the fall of Atlantis. This is not just myth, it is a lesson carved into legend. A reminder that civilizations collapse, not from ignorance, but from arrogance. What if the downfall of Atlantis was not a myth, but a lesson for us all? Stay tuned, because this hidden knowledge is more dangerous than you think. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And hey, let me know where you're watching from, whether it's your couch, your bed, or hiding under a blanket, like an ancient priest trying to dodge a prophecy. Long before the tremors shook the land and the ocean rose in fury, Thoth saw what others refused to see. He was not merely a keeper of knowledge, but a guardian of balance, a voice that spoke of restraint. In a city intoxicated by its own brilliance, Atlantis glittered with prosperity, its towers gleaming, its machines humming, its citizens basking in the glow of progress. Yet beneath that glow, Thoth sensed a shadow creeping closer. He warned the rulers that their experiments were pushing energies beyond their natural limits. Crystals flickered when forced to resonate too strongly. Machines vibrated with unstable power, and chants tuned to unnatural frequencies echoed with discord instead of harmony. These were not accidents, he said, but signs of imbalance. The earth was whispering, the ocean was stirring, and the skies were restless. But the rulers dismissed him, laughing at the idea that their brilliance could falter. Thoth's warnings grew more urgent. He spoke of the dangers of pride, of the folly of believing that power could be bent endlessly without consequence. He reminded them that harmony was the foundation of Atlantis, that balance was not weakness but strength. Yet his words fell on deaf ears. The rulers were intoxicated by ambition, the priests seduced by glory, and the citizens dazzled by spectacle. Humor lingers in hindsight because the Atlanteans were a bit like children, insisting they could juggle fire without getting burned. Thoth stood there, pointing out the flames, while they cheered themselves on, convinced that nothing could go wrong. His ominous warning was not cryptic, it was clear, direct, and desperate. But arrogance is louder than wisdom, and the rulers chose to ignore him. The betrayal began here, not with daggers or conspiracies, but with silence. The rulers betrayed Thoth by dismissing his words. The priests betrayed wisdom by following pride, and the citizens betrayed themselves by refusing to listen. The warning was given, but it was ignored. and in that ignorance the seeds of destruction were sown. Thoth's ominous warning remains etched in legend as a reminder. Civilizations do not fall because they lack knowledge. They fall because they refuse to heed wisdom. Atlantis had everything it needed to endure forever. But it chose pride over balance, ambition over restraint, and arrogance over humility. The warning was clear, but the fall was inevitable. Atlantis glittered like a jewel upon the sea, its towers gleaming with crystalline light, its streets alive with prosperity, and its people convinced that their brilliance would last forever. Yet, beneath the glow of progress, a shadow stirred, a betrayal concealed for millennia. Hidden not in daggers or conspiracies, whispered in alleys, but in choices cloaked as ambition. Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, saw it clearly. The betrayal was not sudden, it was gradual, woven into the very fabric of Atlantis's rise. The rulers, intoxicated by power, betrayed their vows to protect balance. Priests, seduced by glory, betrayed their sacred duty to guard restraint. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, betrayed their instincts, cheering experiments that rattled the harmony of nature. Each betrayal was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a tide that would sweep the continent away. The hidden betrayal was the belief that wisdom could be ignored. The Atlanteans had mastered energies that resonated with the earth, machines that stabilized the land, chants that aligned with the stars. Yet they chose to push beyond limits, convinced that greater power meant greater glory. They betrayed the very harmony that sustained them, and in doing so, they betrayed themselves. Thoth recorded that the betrayal was concealed behind the language of progress. Rulers spoke of innovation, priests spoke of enlightenment, citizens spoke of destiny. But beneath those words lay arrogance, ambition, and pride. The betrayal was not seen as betrayal at all. It was celebrated as triumph. That was its danger. It hid in plain sight, disguised as brilliance. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children insisting they could stack blocks higher and higher without them toppling. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the wobble, while they cheered themselves on, convinced that nothing could go wrong. The betrayal was not a single act, but 1,000 small choices, each ignored, each dismissed, each celebrated, until the tower collapsed. The hidden betrayal remains the most haunting part of Atlantis's story. It was not an enemy from outside, not a stranger with a dagger, but Atlantis itself turning against its own wisdom. The fall was not inevitable, it was chosen, and that choice, concealed beneath pride, doomed an entire civilization. Atlantis, at its height, was dazzling towers, shimmering with crystalline light, temples resonating with chants that seemed to touch the stars, and citizens basking in prosperity. Yet, beneath the glow of progress, a storm brewed. The rulers, once united in their duty, began to compete for dominance. Each sought to prove themselves greater, more powerful, more divine. What began as cooperation turned into rivalry, and that rivalry became the power struggle that tore Atlantis apart. Thoth recorded that the rulers were intoxicated by ambition. They forced machines to roar louder than they were designed to, demanded crystals resonate at higher frequencies, and commanded priests to amplify chants until they rattled the heavens. Each ruler wanted to outshine the others, convinced that supremacy would secure their legacy. But in their contest, they abandoned restraint. The priests, who should have been guardians of wisdom, betrayed their vows by following the rulers. They cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that greater power meant greater glory. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered the experiments, ignoring the tremors beneath their feet and the flicker of crystals strained beyond their limits. The power struggle was not hidden, it was celebrated, and in that celebration, Atlantis betrayed itself. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children competing to see who could build the tallest tower of blocks, ignoring the wobble until the whole thing collapsed. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the cracks, but his warnings were drowned out by the roar of ambition. The rulers were too busy proving themselves gods to notice that the ground beneath them was splitting. The power struggle was the betrayal made visible. It was no longer concealed in whispers or cloaked in progress. It was a contest of pride played out in the open. The rulers betrayed balance, the priests betrayed wisdom, the citizens betrayed caution. Atlantis was tearing itself apart, not from outside enemies, but from within. Thoth's account makes clear that the power struggle was the turning point. It transformed prosperity into arrogance, harmony into discord, wisdom into folly. The rulers believed they were securing greatness, but in truth, they were accelerating destruction. The power struggle was not only a contest for dominance, it was the betrayal that doomed Atlantis. Atlantis shimmered with prosperity, its towers gleaming like jewels, its streets alive with chants and laughter, and its citizens basking in the glow of progress. Yet within that brilliance, a shadow moved quietly. It was not an enemy from beyond the sea, nor a stranger with a dagger, but something far more dangerous, betrayal hiding in plain sight. Thoth recorded that the betrayers were not outsiders but Atlanteans themselves. They walked the same streets, lived in the same towers, and prayed in the same temples. They were rulers intoxicated by ambition, priests seduced by glory, and citizens dazzled by spectacle. The shadow in the city was not a single figure, but a collective blindness, a willingness to ignore wisdom in pursuit of power. The rulers betrayed balance by competing for dominance, forcing machines to roar louder, crystals to resonate higher, and chants to echo with unnatural force. The priests betrayed their vows by cloaking ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that greater power meant greater glory. Citizens betrayed their instincts by cheering the spectacle, ignoring the tremors beneath their feet and the flicker of crystals strained beyond their limits. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children, insisting they could juggle fire while standing in a room full of hay. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the flames, but his warnings were drowned out by the roar of ambition. The shadow was not hidden in darkness, it was celebrated in light, disguised as progress, cloaked in brilliance. The shadow in the city was betrayal itself, moving silently through decisions, choices, and ambitions. It was not seen as betrayal at all. It was embraced as triumph. That was its danger. It hid in plain sight, celebrated by those who believed themselves invincible. Thoth's account makes clear that the shadow was the true enemy of Atlantis. It was not a foreign invader or a natural disaster, but pride, ambition, and arrogance woven into the heart of the city. The betrayers were Atlanteans themselves, and their shadow doomed the civilization they loved. Atlantis did not begin as a legend. It began as a vision, a dream carved into stone and crystal, nurtured by wisdom and guided by harmony. Thoth's account describes its rise as nothing short of miraculous. Atlanteans mastered energies that resonated with the earth. They tuned crystals to pulse with healing light and aligned their temples with the stars so perfectly that the heavens seemed to lean closer. The city grew from modest settlements into a sprawling empire of brilliance. Towers shimmered with crystalline glow. Bridges arched gracefully across waterways, and marketplaces bustled with prosperity. Farmers thrived with crops nourished by energies. Healers restored health with vibrations that soothed the body, and priests guided chants that echoed with harmony. Atlantis was not only powerful, it was balanced, a civilization built upon respect for nature's laws. Yet prosperity has a way of breeding pride. As Atlantis rose higher, its people began to believe they were invincible. The rulers basked in glory, convinced that their brilliance proved their divinity. Priests, once guardians of restraint, began to cloak ambition in the language of enlightenment. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered experiments that pushed energies beyond their natural limits. The rise of Atlantis was dazzling, but within its brilliance lay the seeds of arrogance. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were a bit like children who had built the tallest tower of blocks. They insisted they could stack just one more without it toppling. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the wobble, but his warnings were drowned out by the roar of ambition. The rise was celebrated, but the cracks were already forming. Atlantis rose from prosperity to pride, from harmony to arrogance, from wisdom to folly. Its brilliance was unmatched, its achievements astonishing, but its rise was also its downfall. For in rising so high, Atlantis forgot the foundation upon which it was built, balance. And once balance was abandoned, the fall became inevitable. Atlantis glowed with a brilliance that seemed eternal. Its towers shimmered like beacons. Its temples resonated with chants that touched the stars, and its citizens walked with confidence. Yet, amid the dazzling prosperity, Thoth stood apart, his gaze fixed not on the glittering present, but on the shadows of what was to come. He foresaw the cracks that others refused to see. The tremors beneath the land were not accidents, they were warnings. The crystals, strained beyond their natural limits, flickered with instability. The chants, tuned to unnatural frequencies, echoed with discord instead of harmony. To Thoth, these were not signs of progress, but omens of collapse. His prophecy was clear. If Atlantis continued down its path of pride and ambition, the forces of earth, sky, and sea would unite in judgment. The rulers dismissed him, laughing at the idea that their brilliance could falter. Priests cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that greater power meant greater glory. Citizens cheered the spectacle, ignoring the imbalance that grew beneath their feet. Thoth's prophecy was drowned out by the roar of ambition, his warnings silenced by pride. A civilization convinced of its invincibility. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children, stacking blocks higher and higher, insisting the tower would never topple. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the wobble, but his words were ignored. His prophecy was not cryptic, it was direct, urgent, and desperate. Yet arrogance is louder than wisdom, and Atlantis chose pride over caution. Thoth's dire prophecy remains etched in legend as a reminder. Civilizations do not fall because they lack knowledge. They fall because they refuse to heed wisdom. Atlantis had everything it needed to endure forever, but it chose ambition over balance, arrogance over humility, and pride over restraint. The prophecy was given, but the fall was inevitable. Atlantis was dazzling on the surface, but beneath its brilliance, whispers stirred. The rulers, intoxicated by ambition, gathered in hidden chambers, away from the glow of the crystalline towers. It was here, in secrecy, that the betrayal deepened. Thoth recorded that this meeting was not a gathering of wisdom, but of pride. The rulers spoke not of harmony or balance, but of power. They plotted to amplify energies beyond restraint, to push machines past their limits. They forced crystals into resonances that nature itself resisted. They believed that by harnessing forbidden frequencies, they could stabilize the continent and prove their supremacy. It was a gamble, cloaked in arrogance, a decision that would seal Atlantis's fate. The priests, who should have been guardians of restraint, joined them. They cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that greater power meant greater glory. Citizens were left unaware, their voices drowned out by the secrecy of the meeting. The betrayal was no longer hidden in small choices. It was deliberate, calculated, and irreversible. Humor lingers in hindsight because the rulers were like gamblers, convinced they could win one more hand. Even as the table collapsed beneath them, Thoth stood apart, warning of the danger, but his words were ignored. The secret meeting was not about saving Atlantis. It was about proving dominance. And in that pursuit, the rulers betrayed the very foundation of their civilization. The secret meeting remains one of the most haunting moments in Thoth's account. It was here that Atlantis chose pride over balance, ambition over wisdom, arrogance over humility. The decision made in secrecy doomed the city in the open. For once the forces of nature were provoked, they would not be silenced. Atlantis's fate was sealed not by accident, but by betrayal whispered in hidden chambers. Atlantis had reached a point of no return. Secret meetings had planted seeds of betrayal, sealing the continent's fate. Thoth recorded rulers, intoxicated by ambition and pride, gathered to decide on pushing experiments further. They believed amplifying energies beyond restraint would stabilize the land and prove their supremacy. It was a gamble, cloaked in arrogance. The rulers ignored tremors, dismissed flickering crystals, strained to breaking. They silenced priests who whispered caution. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered the promise of greater glory. The decision was made not in wisdom, but in pride, and with it, Atlantis betrayed itself completely. Thoth's warnings were clear, but drowned out by ambition. He spoke of balance, harmony, and restraint. His words were brushed aside. The rulers declared Atlantis would rise higher, shine brighter, prove invincible. In truth, they had chosen destruction. Humor lingers in hindsight. Atlanteans were like gamblers, convinced they could win one more hand, even as the table collapsed beneath them. The fateful decision was not about saving Atlantis. It was about proving dominance. And in that pursuit, the rulers betrayed the very foundation of their civilization. The fateful decision remains the most haunting moment in Thoth's account. It was here that Atlantis chose pride over balance, ambition over wisdom, arrogance over humility. The choice was celebrated as triumph, but it was, in fact, the beginning of the end. Once the decision was made, the forces of earth, sky, and sea were provoked, and Atlantis's fall became inevitable. Atlantis still glittered, but the shimmer had begun to crack. The towers that once pulsed with crystalline light flickered faintly. Machines that had hummed with stability now groaned under strain. Chants that once resonated with harmony echoed with discord. The betrayal whispered in secret meetings was beginning to show itself in the open. Signs of collapse emerged everywhere. Farmers noticed their crops failing despite the energies meant to nourish them. Animals fled the fields, sensing imbalance. Citizens felt tremors beneath their feet, subtle at first, then stronger, rattling the foundations of homes and temples. The ocean, once calm and obedient to Atlantean science, began to stir restlessly, waves rising higher than before. Thoth recorded these signs with weary precision. He saw crystals strained beyond their natural limits, their glow dimming. He heard chants tuned to frequencies that no longer soothed but agitated, filling the air with unease. He felt the tremors that shook the land, each one a warning ignored by rulers too intoxicated by ambition to listen. The rulers, blinded by pride, dismissed the signs as minor inconveniences. They declared that greater experiments would restore balance, more power would solve the instability. Priests cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, insisting that progress required sacrifice. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered the promises, ignoring the cracks spreading beneath their feet. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like sailors patching holes in a sinking ship with paper, convinced the ocean would respect their brilliance. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the leaks, but his warnings were drowned out by the roar of ambition. Atlantis was on the brink. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was visible in every flicker, every tremor, every restless wave. The city stood at the edge of collapse, yet its people refused to see it. They believed themselves invincible, even as the ground split beneath them. Thoth's account makes clear that the brink was not sudden. It was gradual, 1,000 small signs ignored until they became impossible to deny. Atlantis was not destroyed by accident, but by arrogance, by a refusal to heed wisdom, by betrayal embraced as progress. The brink was the moment when survival was still possible, but pride ensured that destruction was chosen instead. Atlantis was already trembling under the weight of its own ambition when a figure appeared in Thoth's account, a presence that seemed to move like a shadow through the glittering streets. He was not a ruler, nor a priest, nor a citizen. He was something else entirely, a mysterious stranger whose whispers carried more weight than wisdom itself. Thoth described him as a voice that urged the rulers toward greater ambition. He spoke of untapped power, of energies waiting to be unleashed, of glory that could make Atlantis eternal. His words were honeyed, seductive, and dangerous. The rulers, already intoxicated by pride, listened eagerly. They believed he was a prophet, a guide, a divine messenger. In truth, he was the puppet master, pulling strings that would unravel the city. The priests, too, were swayed. They cloaked his promises in the language of enlightenment, declaring his visions proof of destiny. Citizens felt the effects of his influence in experiments that grew more reckless, machines that roared louder. The crystals strained harder. The mysterious stranger was not seen by all, but his shadow touched every corner of Atlantis. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children convinced a stranger offering endless candy had their best interests. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the danger, but his warnings were drowned out by the allure of promises too sweet to resist. Who was the stranger? Thoth never revealed his identity. Perhaps he was a symbol of pride itself. Perhaps a manipulator from beyond. Perhaps simply a man who knew how to whisper ambition into eager ears. His mystery remains, but his influence is undeniable. The mysterious stranger was the spark that ignited the conspiracy. He whispered of power, The rulers listened, the priests followed, and the citizens cheered. Atlantis was already betraying itself, but with his presence, the betrayal deepened. The stranger did not destroy Atlantis directly. He simply nudged it further down the path it had already chosen. And in that nudge, the fall became inevitable. Atlantis was dazzling on the surface, but beneath its brilliance, betrayal had already taken root. It did not arrive with armies or invaders. It grew quietly, like vines creeping through cracks in stone. Thoth's account describes how the conspiracy was woven into the very heart of the city, hidden not in shadows but in ambition disguised as progress. The mysterious stranger had whispered promises of untapped power, and the rulers listened. They gathered in secret, plotting to amplify energies beyond restraint, convinced that greater glory awaited them. Priests, once guardians of wisdom, cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that these experiments were proof of destiny. Citizens, unaware of the full truth, cheered the spectacle, dazzled by the promise of invincibility. The conspiracy was not seen as betrayal at all. It was celebrated as triumph. Thoth recorded that the conspiracy spread like a contagion. Each ruler sought to outshine the others, forcing machines to roar louder, crystals to resonate higher, chants to echo with unnatural force. Priests followed, citizens applauded, and the betrayal deepened. The conspiracy was not hidden in darkness. It was woven into the light, disguised as progress, cloaked in brilliance. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children, convinced they could keep stacking blocks higher, without the tower ever toppling. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the wobble, but his warnings were drowned out by ambition. The conspiracy was not a single act, but 1,000 small choices, each ignored, each dismissed, each celebrated, until collapse became inevitable. The hidden conspiracy remains one of the most haunting parts of Atlantis's story. It was not an enemy from outside, not a stranger with a dagger, but Atlantis itself turning against its own wisdom. The betrayal was deliberate, calculated, and embraced. And in that embrace, the fall of Atlantis was sealed. Atlantis still shimmered with the illusion of invincibility, but beneath its glittering surface, fractures were spreading. The towers that once pulsed with crystalline brilliance now flickered unevenly. Machines groaned under strain. Chants that had once resonated with harmony carried a faint discord that unsettled even the most devoted priests. The empire was beginning to show cracks. Thoth recorded these signs with meticulous care. Farmers whispered of crops failing despite the energies meant to nourish them. Merchants complained of goods spoiled in transit, as if the very air had grown restless. Citizens felt tremors beneath their feet, subtle at first, then stronger, rattling homes and temples alike. The ocean, once calm and obedient to Atlantean mastery, began to surge unpredictably, waves rising higher than before. The rulers, blinded by ambition, dismissed these cracks as minor inconveniences. They declared greater experiments would restore balance. Priests cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, insisting that sacrifice was necessary for progress. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, ignored the whispers of downfall, cheering promises of glory instead. The Atlanteans were like homeowners, insisting their house was fine, even as the walls creaked, the roof sagged, and the floorboards split. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the damage, but his warnings were drowned out by the roar of ambition. The cracks in the empire were not sudden, they were gradual, 1,000 small signs ignored until impossible to deny. Each flicker of a crystal, each tremor beneath the land, each restless wave was a warning. Yet Atlantis refused to listen. The cracks widened, spreading through the empire like fractures in glass. And with each ignored sign, the fall drew closer. Thoth's account makes clear that the cracks were not merely physical, but spiritual. The harmony that had sustained Atlantis was broken, replaced by arrogance and pride. The empire was no longer united by wisdom, but divided by ambition. The cracks were whispers of downfall. Though faint at first, they grew louder until they became the roar of destruction. Atlantis was unraveling, and the betrayers were too blinded by pride to see it. Atlantis had always thrived on wisdom, its prosperity built upon harmony with the forces of nature. Crystals pulsed with healing light, machines hummed with stabilizing energy, and chants resonated with the stars. But as pride grew, so too did curiosity. Unchecked by restraint, it led Atlanteans to knowledge never meant to be wielded. Thoth recorded that rulers sought secrets deep within the earth, energies so potent they could bend reality itself. These were not the gentle harmonies that sustained Atlantis, but raw, volatile forces, forbidden for good reason. The priests, once guardians of wisdom, cloaked this pursuit in the language of enlightenment. Declaring forbidden knowledge was the key to eternal glory. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered the experiments, unaware of the danger. The forbidden knowledge was not simply power, it was imbalance. Crystals strained beyond their natural limits, fractured under pressure. Machines forced to resonate with destructive frequencies shook violently, destabilizing the land. Chants tuned to unnatural harmonies provoked storms instead of calming them. Atlantis was no longer aligned with nature. It was attempting to dominate it. Humor lingers in hindsight. Atlanteans were like children, insisting they could play with lightning as a harmless toy. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the sparks, but his warnings were drowned out by ambition. The forbidden knowledge was celebrated as triumph, but in truth, it was the betrayal that doomed the city. Thoth's account makes clear that Atlantis was too powerful for its own good. The forbidden knowledge was not a gift, but a curse, a force that could not be controlled. By pursuing it, the rulers betrayed balance, the priests betrayed wisdom, and the citizens betrayed caution. Atlantis had everything it needed to endure forever, but it chose arrogance over humility, ambition over restraint. The forbidden knowledge remains one of the most haunting parts of Atlantis's story. It was not ignorance that destroyed the city, but the deliberate choice to wield power that should have remained hidden. In that choice, Atlantis sealed its fate, and the betrayal became irreversible. As Atlantis marched toward its own undoing, Thoth did not simply stand by. He fought, though not with armies or weapons, but with wisdom, patience, and quiet persistence. He was a guardian who knew the value of balance. His struggle was silent, hidden beneath the roar of ambition, drowned out by the glittering spectacle of a civilization intoxicated with pride. Thoth inscribed warnings into stone, etched truths into temples, and whispered caution to those willing to listen. He reminded the rulers that harmony was the foundation of Atlantis, that restraint was not weakness but strength. He urged the priests to remember their vows, to guard wisdom instead of cloaking ambition in the language of enlightenment. He spoke to citizens, warning them of tremors beneath their feet, flickering crystals, and chants that no longer resonated with harmony. But his struggle was met with silence. The rulers dismissed him, laughing at the idea that their brilliance could falter. Priests ignored him, seduced by promises of glory. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, cheered louder than his warnings could reach. Thoth's struggle was not against ignorance, but against arrogance, and arrogance is louder than wisdom. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like children insisting they could juggle fire while standing in a room full of hay. Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the flames, but his words were drowned out by ambition. His struggle was not a failure of effort, but a failure of listening. Thoth's silent struggle remains one of the most poignant parts of Atlantis' story. He fought not with force, but with truth, not with dominance, but with balance. He preserved wisdom in hidden records, inscribed warnings for future generations, and whispered truths that would echo long after Atlantis was gone. His struggle could not save the city, but it ensured that the lesson would endure. Atlantis fell because it betrayed itself, but Thoth's silent struggle ensured that humanity would remember. His warnings, though ignored in his time, became the echoes of legend, reminders carved into myth that pride destroys, arrogance blinds, and betrayal begins with silence. Atlantis trembled, its brilliance dimming as cracks spread through towers and tremors shook the land. The ocean stirred restlessly, waves rising higher, and chants that once resonated with harmony now echoed with discord. Amid the chaos, Thoth gave his final warning, a message etched not in loud proclamations, but in cryptic words. He spoke of balance, of harmony, of restraint. He reminded the rulers that Atlantis had been built upon respect for nature's laws. Prosperity was born from wisdom, not arrogance. His warning was not a plea, but a prophecy. If Atlantis continued to betray itself, destruction would come swiftly, and nothing could stop it. The rulers dismissed him, laughing at the idea that their brilliance could falter. Priests cloaked ambition in the language of enlightenment, declaring that greater power meant greater glory. Citizens, dazzled by spectacle, ignored the tremors beneath their feet and the flicker of crystals strained to breaking. Thoth's final warning was drowned out by the roar of ambition, silenced by pride. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like sailors, insisting their ship was unsinkable. Even as water poured through the cracks, Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the leaks, but his words were ignored. His final warning was not cryptic. It was clear, urgent, and desperate. Yet arrogance is louder than wisdom. Atlantis chose pride over caution. Thoth's final warning remains etched in legend as a reminder. Civilizations do not fall because they lack knowledge. They fall because they refuse to heed wisdom. Atlantis had everything it needed to endure forever, but it chose ambition over balance, arrogance over humility, and pride over restraint. The warning was given, but the fall was inevitable. Atlantis had been trembling for months, its brilliance dimming, its harmony unraveling. Yet when the collapse finally came, it was not gradual. It was sudden, violent, and overwhelming. Thoth's account describes that night as a storm of chaos, when betrayal that had been whispered in secret meetings and cloaked in ambition finally revealed itself in destruction. The rulers had pushed their experiments too far. Crystals strained beyond their limits shattered. Machines roared uncontrollably, and chants, tuned to forbidden frequencies, provoked forces that no one could contain. The earth shook violently, splitting streets and toppling towers. The ocean surged with fury, waves rising higher than the tallest spires, swallowing marketplaces and temples alike. The sky itself seemed to revolt, storms flashing with unnatural light, thunder echoing like judgment. How did it all happen so fast? Thoth explained that the betrayal had been building quietly for years, hidden beneath pride and ambition. Each ignored tremor, each flickering crystal, each restless wave was a warning. But when the final experiment was unleashed, the balance snapped. The forces of earth, sky, and sea, long provoked, responded all at once. The collapse was not a slow unraveling, but a sudden reckoning. The citizens, dazzled by spectacle until the very end, were caught unprepared. They fled through streets that split beneath them, clung to towers that crumbled in their hands, and cried out to rulers who could no longer command the forces they had betrayed. Priests, once guardians of wisdom, found their chance powerless against the storm. The rulers themselves, who had believed they were gods, stood helpless as the empire they built dissolved in a single night. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans were like gamblers, convinced they could win one more hand, only to find the table collapsing beneath them. Thoth stood apart, his warnings vindicated, but his sorrow heavy. He had seen the betrayal unfold slowly, step by step, and he knew the destruction was not fate but choice. The night the betrayal unfolded was the moment Atlantis ceased to be a city and became a legend. Its fall was not caused by ignorance but by arrogance, not by weakness but by pride. It happened so fast because the seeds of destruction had been sown long before, and when they finally bloomed, they consumed everything at once. Atlantis was gone, but Thoth ensured its lesson would echo through time. Civilizations fall not when they lack knowledge, but when they refuse to heed wisdom. Atlantis was collapsing, yet its citizens did not truly understand why. They saw towers flicker, machines groan, and waves rise higher, but the deeper truth was hidden from them. Thoth's account reveals that the betrayal was not only in ambition, but in secrecy. The rulers and priests concealed the dangers, leaving the people blind to the forces that were unraveling their world. What did they not know? They did not know that the crystals powering their civilization were strained beyond natural limits, fracturing under pressure. They did not know that the chants echoing through temples were tuned to forbidden frequencies, provoking storms instead of calming them. They did not know that the rulers had gathered in secret meetings, conspiring to push experiments further despite warnings. They did not know that the mysterious strangers' whispers had guided their leaders into arrogance and imbalance. They did not know that Thoth's warnings had been silenced, drowned out by ambition. Citizens believed Atlantis was invincible. They trusted their rulers, cheered the spectacle, and celebrated progress. They saw tremors as minor inconveniences, flickering crystals as temporary flaws, and rising waves as natural tides. They did not know these were signs of collapse, warnings ignored by those in power. Humor lingers in hindsight because the Atlanteans were like passengers on a ship. Reassured by the captain, even as water poured through the cracks, Thoth stood nearby, pointing out the leaks. But his voice was drowned out by promises of glory. Thoth's account makes clear that ignorance was not the people's fault. It was imposed upon them. The rulers betrayed balance. The priests betrayed wisdom. And in their secrecy, they betrayed the citizens most of all. The Atlanteans were left in the dark, unaware that their world was ending. Until the night the betrayal unfolded and the truth arrived too late. Atlantis did not fall because its people lacked knowledge. It fell because knowledge was hidden from them. And in that concealment, the betrayal was complete. When the betrayal finally unfolded and the empire began to collapse, not all Atlanteans surrendered to despair. Thoth's account describes a handful who tried desperately to save their world, fighting not with weapons but with wisdom, courage, and devotion to balance. Thoth himself inscribed warnings into stone, preserved knowledge in hidden records, and sought to guide those willing to listen. His struggle was not to stop the fall, which had become inevitable, but to ensure the lesson would endure. The Circle of Healers, a group of priests and healers, attempted to restore harmony by retuning chants and stabilizing crystals. They worked tirelessly in temples, trying to counteract the destructive frequencies unleashed by the rulers. Farmers and citizens of the old ways, ordinary people who still honored nature's rhythms, tried to protect their lands, praying to the forces of earth and sea, hoping to calm the imbalance. Their efforts were small but sincere, rooted in humility rather than pride. The Silent Guardians, Thoth wrote of a faction within the priesthood who resisted the conspiracy. They met in secret, attempting to sabotage reckless experiments, though their influence was limited and their voices drowned out by ambition. Despite their efforts, the collapse was too vast, too sudden, too deeply rooted in betrayal. The rulers had provoked forces that could not be contained, and the ocean, sky, and earth responded with fury. The last stand was noble, but it could not reverse what pride had already sealed. Humor lingers in hindsight, because the Atlanteans, who tried to save their city, were like firefighters rushing into a blaze that had already consumed the building. Their courage was real, but the destruction was unstoppable. Thoth's account makes clear that the last stand was not in vain. Though Atlantis was lost, the wisdom preserved by those who resisted ensured that its lessons would echo through time. The city fell, but the memory of its fall and the warnings carved into legend became a gift for future generations. His writings preserved wisdom, warnings, and prophecy, yet they hint at knowledge deliberately concealed or lost in chaos. Leaving us to wonder if he was real or allegorical. The full scope of forbidden knowledge. Atlanteans pushed energies beyond restraint, but their exact nature remains hidden. The true reason for secrecy. Why did rulers conceal so much from their people? Was it arrogance, fear, or manipulation? Humor lingers in hindsight. Atlanteans tore out the final pages of their own book, leaving future generations to guess. The lost truths remind us that history is never complete. Atlantis is remembered for its brilliance, betrayal, and silence. What we do not know may be as important as what we do. And so, the story of Atlantis drifts into mystery, its lessons echoing across time, its secrets hidden beneath the waves.